Hey everyone, it's B007 back for a 10-minute movie review, and this week it is a movie. It is the new Amy Winehouse biopic, Back to Black, which has been made by director Sam Taylor Wood and has a script by Matt Greenhalgh, who also wrote the scripts for Nowhere Boy and Control, two other pop music biopics, so he has some form here. I really was impressed by this film, most of all because of the central performance by Marisa Abela. And if any of you have been watching HBO's investment banking set show Industry, then you'll know her as one of the actresses from that. But really, this is her breakout role, and I think she is going to be a star. She has a performance that is so charismatic and heartbreaking, and even more impressive because she absolutely captures Amy Winehouse's caustic wit, her physical mannerisms, most impressively, her spoken and singing voice. Marissa Abela does all her own singing. There is so much music, so much of Amy Winehouse's music in this film, as there should be. And it's Marissa Abela capturing those performances, which are so well known, right? They're iconic. We all know every gesture, every stumble, every vocal styling. And it was the thing that made me the most nervous going into this film. I think it's what will be most nervous making for most people going into this film, right? How do you capture Amy? And director Sam Taylor Wood really tackles this head on. She has a fantastically kinetic opening scene where a young teenage Amy is at a family gathering and there's lots of music. She comes on the paternal side from an incredibly musical family. And Marissa Abela as Amy just freestyles Fly Me to the Moon, and suddenly you just relax into your cinema seat because you're like, yes, she has it. She's got it. We are in very, very safe hands here. So, a star making turn from Marissa Abela in a film that I think is very human. And it's always going to be put in contrast with Asif Kapadia's 2015 documentary Amy, which I really loved. I think it's a phenomenal doc. And actually, you can listen to the review of that if you go all the way back to episode 98 of this podcast. But what Asif Kapadia sometimes does in his documentaries is he creates heroes and villains. And he did this in his doc of Ayrton Senna, where Alan Prost, the race driver, was made as the antagonist and the villain of a story. And yes, they had a racing competition, but it just went a little bit too far for my taste. And I think in his documentary, there are two villains, right? There's Blake Fielder-Civil, Amy Winehouse's husband, and Mitch Winehouse, her father, and both were shown as effectively avaricious, exploitative men for whom it was advantageous to keep Amy drugged up. Like they didn't want her to take the time to heal herself because that would prevent the money rolling in, and for Blake Fielder-Civil, the drugs rolling in because he was an addict. And in a sense, that narrative, particularly around the husband, plays into how that relationship was depicted in the tabloids at the time. And it reminded me a lot, even at the time, of Whitney Houston and Bobby Brown, that, people thought of Whitney Houston as this sort of like perfect angel, very naive. And that when Bobby Brown comes on the scene, she's exposed to sort of class A drugs and then she ends up dead. And what this film does is it just gives us more nuance. So in this film, as in the documentary, to be fair, you see that Amy Winehouse is troubled way before she meets Blake Fielder-Civil. She is already abusing alcohol to cover up her insecurities and her anxieties. She's already using weed. She's already bulimic. And she's caught in this family that's gone through a divorce. It's just, there's a lot going on with Amy way before she meets Blake Fielder-Civil. When he appears, it's 40 minutes into the film, and her first album, Frank, has become a big success, but somehow isn't quite big enough for the record company to promote in America. And she's told she needs more stage presence. And for a woman who has a lot of insecurities about her appearance and her looks, it's kind of the worst thing she could hear, right? So at this moment, per the film, in walks Blake Fielder-Civil, and he's played by Jack O'Connell. He's not really had a leading role before. If you saw him in Unbroken, a film that Angelina Jolie directed, actually, that was a long time ago though, and he's really good in this. He's as good as Marisa Abela. And when he walks into that pub, he's charming and he's funny and he's got a deep knowledge of music that they can bond over. And you see why they fall in love. And there's no, there's no cynicism about that love story at first, which I love. Because I think the problem is if you have Blake Fielder-Civil from the start as this sort of oily, exploitative drug fiend, it's hard to like wrap your head around why someone as smart as Amy Winehouse would have fallen for him. You've got to see why she fell in love. And I think this film gives us that. It makes us believe that this love story, which then will inflect all of her songs thereafter, what the catalyst was. And I was really grateful for that. The two actors have such a spark. It's totally credible. And what I like about the script is it says, look, when they were first together, this was not exploitative on Fielder-Civil's part. He then does go back to his ex-girlfriend, which is what is famously lyrically described in Back to Black. And that's when it's such a blow to Amy. It's such a blow after her father leaving her mother and her. This is another man leaving her, and it's just gets her. And that's when the drug abuse, the self-harm, the bulimia goes to another level. They do then reunite, and this is where the film has nuance, because it's not painting him out to be, and he was a young drug addict, right? So he also deserves a bit of sympathy. But at that point, there's a conversation between him and his drug dealer, which says, she's got back to black. She is incredibly wealthy now. You have a smack bill that you owe to me, and this is a woman who can pay it off. And that's the point at which they get together again, and you realize that he's doing it because it enables him to keep his Class A drug habit going, and that's when she also gets into the Class A drugs. Tragically for both of them, I think. The second blow, as shown in this biopic, is when he gets put in prison and he gets clean. And realizes, because he's had therapy in prison, what everyone else in the entire world realized by this point, which is that this was an incredibly toxic, codependent relationship that he wants to break free from. And in a sense, the way it's shown in the film, you can't blame him. He's trying to kind of survive. But again, it's another body blow for Amy. And really, this final sort of 45 minutes to an hour of the film is just showing the back and forth between periods when she can get it together, she can go relatively clean, not of the alcohol, but at least of the drugs for certain portions. But in the words of Matt Greenhalgh's script, as voiced by Fielder-Civil, actually, she's always on the edge, and so she's always minutes away from being pushed off the edge and back into the depths of that self-abuse and self-harm. And I think that's what the film gets really well, this fragility, this idea that even at the best moments, there's always this potential that she's going to get rocked back. I think where the film most diverges from the documentary is that you see this period of relative good health. She wants to start recording her third album. In the documentary, it's alleged that basically she was pushed on tour by her manager, promoter, and her dad, and she just was self-sabotaging to get out of the tour. And by this point, her body, after a decade of abuse, bulimia, and alcohol and drugs, her heart can stop at any moment, and ultimately it does. Whereas in this film, and this is where I think people might have a problem with it, in this film, the blame is put more on, she wants to be a wife, she wants to be a mother, she wants to have that solid family that she didn't have growing up because of her parents' divorce. And she's desperately in love with Fielder-Civil. She thinks he's the key to happiness. So when that is taken away from her, when he goes off with another woman and has kids, that body blow is the body blow that sends her over the edge. And I think it's kind of possible for both to coexist, right? It can be both. But I think that, you can see it in some of the criticism of this new film, that people feel the pendulum has been swung too far the other way, that it's gone to be too sympathetic towards the husband and the dad. And I think part of that's because Mitch Winehouse is played by Eddie Marzan. He's a phenomenal actor, but he's also just an incredibly sympathetic screen presence. It's really hard to hate him. And in this depiction, Mitch Winehouse is a loving father, but one who's just completely out of his depth. He just doesn't know how to deal with his daughter's drug addiction. And, when she's late for meetings and she's mouthy, he kind of shrugs his shoulders and says, "That's Amy." And you kind of feel that that's how she's been parented her entire life. Something that, by the way, is backed up by the Kapadia documentary. And actually, something in the documentary struck me that the mother at some point says, when she was like 15, 16, she told both parents that she was bulimic. And both of them sort of shrugged it off and said, well, I get, they didn't know what to do with that information. And we're like, well, maybe she'll grow out of it. And you kind of get the feeling then when Mitch Winehouse, who's been so skewered for not forcing her into rehab when her manager, Nick Shymansky, wanted her to go in, that it was kind of like an inability to grasp the severity of the situation. Anyway, I think, opinions are going to vary on how Mitch in particular has been portrayed, but also Blake Fielder-Civil. But I think this film does get at the heart of Amy Winehouse because it captures young love's dream. It captures that tragic love story and why she fell in love with Blake, which I don't think I've ever understood up until now. The other love story it captures, which we didn't see really any of in the documentary, or I'd had no idea about, was Amy's deep, passionate love for her grandma, her Nan, played by Leslie Manville here, who herself was a very accomplished jazz singer playing at Ronnie Scott's and Birdland, and gave Amy this amazing appreciation for jazz, was her style icon, inspired some of those vintage looks that Amy used to wear. And it's a beautiful relationship shown in this film. So for that alone, I would watch the film because it gives a new aspect onto Amy's life and explains a lot of her talent and a lot of her jazz snobbery and knowledge. And I think that's such an essential part of her, that she thought of herself as a jazz singer, as a jazz guitarist. And this film anchors Amy in jazz, and it anchors her in love of her nan, love of her dad, love of Blake Fielder-Civil. And in that respect, I think it gets Amy right. It may or may not get Mitch right or Blake Fielder-Civil right, but I think it gets her right. And kudos to Marisa Abela for bringing that to screen. I think this is a really phenomenal performance and one that you absolutely should try and see. So, whether you agree or disagree with my take, and I sense this is going to be a very controversial film, feel free to leave a comment on the blog at bina007.com, write a comment on the YouTube channel. The film is rated R. It has a running time of 122 minutes. It went on release in the UK this weekend and goes on release in the USA on May 17th. In the meantime, thank you for listening.